Hey everyone, it's Dave from Curtis Crafts, and today I make a Microsoft monolith a little more interesting. So to start, my idea for this project came from having to move my Xbox One out of the entertainment center and set this Series X on top of the entertainment center. Since it was so pronounced and now out in view, I wanted to make it look interesting to match the rest of my decorum. And for the visual inspiration, I was going for something Cyberpunk influenced because hopefully that game's supposed to come out in a few days. Hopefully. The other thing I wanted to do was make a temporary skin that just went over the outside of the Xbox and not do any kind of permanent modification to the body itself. So I came up with making a skin out of 16th inch styrene, and that's the majority of the material I'm going to be using for this project. It's really simple to work with, especially in 16th inch like this. And I've definitely learned a lot more about working with this material and making better cuts than I did in the very first video I ever made, and the link for that is right up there. For the lowest layer, I cut out provisions so that the disk drive would still function, the USB drive on the front, as well as the controller pairing button would function, and of course the power button. The Series X has some very perfect sides to it, and they're almost 6 inches wide, but they're actually just about an 1/8 inch shy of that. Height-wise, it's almost 12, but the top and the bottom actually have a dish shape to them, so it's not quite a perfect rectangle. I measure the basic skin layout to be an exact match to the dimensions of the body of the Xbox Series X, and then all the further detail will layer on top of this.
Yeah, I actually remember hearing about these. I think my great-grandparents were based on the Series X.
I didn't even know robots could have grandparents.
I don't want to talk about it.
Okay, not my business. Let's just keep it focused on...
Why do people call things cyberpunk? Things in the future are just like this. It's just normal. Not everyone is a punk, and nobody's cyber either.
I didn't really choose...
I'm cyber. It's offensive.
So... I cut the power button outline with a knife, and later on I'm going to go back with some sandpaper and file the edges so that they're perfectly round.
It's not like everyone's wearing denim jackets with spiky hair or anything with, like a keyboard on their forearm. I wish I had an arm.
Once the basic skin is done, I start cutting the second and third level of detail. I want this to be a very three-dimensional piece, and I also want it to have a lot of hard edges. Just like in my previous projects, I'm using Weld-On 3 to actually bond all of this plastic together. I add some underneath each small piece and then along the edges so that the edges weld themselves together. Also, any negative area that I cut out in each level of detail, I wind up using the whole thing or at least a part of it in the third level of detail, and it works out pretty well. If you've never worked in styrene, it's actually really simple to work with. I get this from a place called Tap Plastics, which is local to me. The total cost of materials on this project is about $10 as far as the crafting goes. All you'd need to do besides that is source the paint you're going to use, which in this case I'll be airbrushing on some color shift paint, and then using acrylic paint for the weathering and details. But be sure to give yourself adequate ventilation if you use this weld-on. Otherwise, super glue and other adhesives might work. I'm not using any kind of pattern or drawing, and I am making this up as I go, but it is following a similar design. And for the sides, I don't want them to be symmetrical, but I wanted to use two pieces that were identical and mirror them so that one faced up and one faced down in order to start off the thought process for making the rest of the sides. On one side, I decided I would have a neon piece of acrylic that would react to UV light, and that might look kind of cool. And then on the other side, I'm just going to make it rather simplified and put some text. Once I'm done and satisfied with the shape, then I move on to sanding the entire piece. And once I've gotten rid of the rough edges, I move on to primer. And in this case, I'm going to be using a gray. Once the primer was laid down, I moved on to adding my base coat, which was Folk Art Color Shift, and the color is Blue Flash that I'm spraying through my Iwata airbrush. And this should be a nice cyberpunk color as it morphs from blue to purple depending on what light you look at it in. I paint a couple areas in matte black because I intend to go back and paint these with a color called Ground is Lava, which is made by a company called Turbo Dork, and they make some really great metallic miniature paints if you want to switch it up and move away from using your general flat colors. I've personally used 4 or 5 of the colors on a few different projects which I'll show in the future, and I recommend you try them out, and I'll have a link for that in the description below. They definitely work best when airbrushed, and in this case they do work when you brush them out by hand, and it's just going to take about 6 to 8 coats in order to get something that's not so translucent. After that, it's time to fire up the Cricut Air 2, where I came up with some simple designs for some text. One line just says Series X, and then I found some Japanese billboard style font to type out the words Cyberpunk and then 2077 in Arabic numerals. I saw this combination of Japanese and English on a lot of the concept art, and it also matches up with things like Blade Runner and other cyberpunk universes.
I can't read Japanese. Actually, can't read in general. Robots are just designed to understand what they're looking at.
Well, you'll like this next part because we're gonna be doing the weathering, which is where you add all the damage and give this thing life.
This is the part where we can't have nice things. Yeah, I knew you were about to ruin it.
I'm starting off with some silver just to make some of the edges look worn, and then after that I'm going to go in with some watered down black acrylic to weather up all of the edges and make it look greasy. After that I add in some yellow, which adds a nice little rust or some kind of paint that's been worn off effect. I didn't know, but I really liked the contrast between the yellow and the blue. Once the painting's done, it's time to attach the skin to the Series X. I'm doing this in a non-permanent fashion using some double-sided tape, and I put it on each of the corners and anywhere where it needs to stay secured, like the bottom and the top, and close to the disk drive. This will allow me to maybe do something else in the future, and it won't affect the Xbox at all. Once the Cyberpunk skin was attached, I etched with sandpaper on some UV reactive acrylic, and then mounted that piece in the side holder that I had made earlier. I might give this its own LED in the future, but for now it reacts to lights in the room. And my Cyberpunk 2077 inspired Series X is done, and ready to go back on the entertainment center. If you like this project and want to see other things like this, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Leave a like and tell me what you thought about it in the comments below.